Hi, I'm Ben Schwartz, and this is the latest in our segment of Politics 2012. Obviously, we've got an election coming up, and we've got a very interested electorate in the Amherst media radius, and we have a couple of folks here with us today who represent, different ends of the political spectrum, not too far to the left nor too far to the right necessarily, and we're going to have a lively conversation about the upcoming election and some of the issues and values at stake in it. On my right is State Representative Paul Mark, who lives in Peru, Massachusetts, a town, I believe, of 847
right around
people.
Yep.
And you represent the 2nd Berkshire District in the House,
Yep.
which by redistricting is going to also include part of Franklin County. Is that correct?
Correct.
And on my left is Dr. Jay Fleitman, who is a pulmonologist practicing in Northampton, who is a regular contributor to the, the Gazette?
The Gazette and the Worcester Telegram.
And the Worcester Telegram. And Dr. Fleitman ran for Congress in 2010 and I'm not sure, are you planning on running again for Congress? I know that you got redistricted, and we can talk a little bit about that later on, but what are your future plans, Doctor?
I'm just working the grassroots these days.
Right, but not ruling anything out necessarily.
Oh, I would never rule anything out.
Understood. Now, Paul, you're a Democrat.
Yep.
And you were a Verizon lineman.
I was.
Prior to running for office. You've been in office since 2010.
Yep.
And so therefore relatively new to elective office. How are you enjoying it? And please tell us a little bit about what your experience has been.
So far, I'm enjoying it. So my district, the 2nd Berkshire District, is the largest geographic district in the entire state.
Sure.
So it's 22 communities, cities and towns, located in Berkshire, Franklin, and Hampshire County. Stretches from the New York border all the way to the New Hampshire border, Richmond and Northfield. So as a consequence of having that district, I've done over 57,000 miles in 2011 in my car.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I spent a lot of time in my car. But it's been an enjoyable experience. It's interesting. You're always doing something different. You have a day like today where you're having a nice discussion. Yesterday I was talking to middle school students out in the town of Dalton. A couple of weeks ago I was down in New Bedford touring fisheries because I'm on the agriculture committee. So it's an interesting experience. It's a lot of hours, it's a lot of work, and it's nothing like people imagine, say, a congressional congressman or a senator. We don't have a staff of 20. I don't have a budget for all these people. I have one legislative aide, and that is it. And he has to split his time between Boston and the various towns I represent. Right now he's in Dalton at the town hall, because I don't have
Oh, really?
My district is so big I don't have a set office anywhere. I rove town hall to town hall.
I see.
I do Greenfield
An
one day.
itinerant state representative.
Exactly,
Understood.
nomad. But yeah, so far I'm enjoying it. I'm running for a 2nd term, and I'm excited to get into a 2nd term now that I kind of have an idea of how to do the job.
Well, but this gets to an underlying question, which is why did you run in the first place? I know that you're active. I don't know if you're still a union member, but you certainly were active in the unions. And what was your animating motivation for running?
The long story, and I'll keep it quick. When I was 8 years old, Dukakis was running for president.
Sure.
And I was at a 4th of July parade. And for whatever reason, he's marching in the parade. Out of all these people on the side of the road, he comes over and he shakes little Paul Mark's hand. And I got really excited. He's like, oh, that guy's going to be the president. And so I started following the campaign, and I'm really excited. And election day came, and then he lost. And I couldn't believe it. So I decided then that I was going to start getting involved in politics, when I got a little bit older. So when I was 16, I started holding signs for Bill Clinton, that kind of thing, when he was running for re-election. And since then, I've been just involved in every level. I've done local town meetings. I mean, I'm in a town of 850 people, so everyone goes and has a direct voice. I've done statewide. I've done presidential campaigns, et cetera. When I was 20 years old, I got this job at the telephone company. It was Bell Atlantic, now it's called Verizon, and I got involved in the union, the IBEW, and I went back to school. And while I worked there full time, I put myself through bachelor's degree, associate's degree, master's degree right here at UMass Amherst, law degree at Suffolk down in Boston, and a doctorate in law and policy from Northeastern. I did it all while working full time and commuting back and forth to Boston from the Berkshires, so I'm a big fan of driving. But one of the things that made me go to law school was, as a union steward, we would have grievances and such against the company, and I would see that we would usually lose the grievances, and I thought to myself, well, there's lawyers on their side of the table, so maybe if I went to law school, maybe we would start winning. And then I got to law school and I realized, yeah, right, it's not that easy, that it's about sometimes the law itself. So
Right.
when the former representative of my district, Dennis Geyer, announced he wasn't going to run for re-election, people from my community, people from work started calling me and saying, well, you know so much about politics, you're so involved, put your money where your mouth is.
Right.
And
They,
so-
they knew you as a hobbyist busybody. You figured, you figured you might as well run for it.
Exactly.
No, Dr. Fleitman, you have been described as a libertarian. And I think I know what that means, but educate us a little bit. If that's an accurate designation, please let us know what that means for you.
Well, I'd say I have libertarian tendencies.
Sure.
When I you know, like any political philosophy, it can be taken to extremes. And when I started running for Congress, and people would ask me what kind of Republican I was, I would often say I'm sort of a libertarian Republican. And then one day, somebody came up to me early in the campaign and said, "Gee, I understand you support legalization of heroin." And I said, well, no. And because that is sort of the taken to the logical extreme of libertarianism, that could be a position.
Sure.
So I actually stopped saying that after that happened.
Stop saying no or stop
No,
saying?
I stopped saying that I was a libertarian Republican.
Oh, I see.
At least while I was campaigning. Libertarians fundamentally take as their starting point in their political philosophy the idea that the United States is, as a society, is predicated on the protection and defense of degrees of freedom and liberty of the individual citizen, and that the Constitution is created fundamentally to protect those freedoms and liberties. The Constitution primarily being a restriction on the powers of the government, a limitation of the powers of the government to make sure that its citizens are not imposed upon by increasing power of a centralized government. And so libertarianism comes from that. And I think that in essence is the political philosophy of it. Now, of course, like anything, it can be taken to extremes in one direction or another. But that's in the essence of where my politics are.
Now, do you, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, though I play one on TV, but the question is, the Constitution may have been set up by your description to protect people against a too powerful government. But my understanding is it did not envision the sort of growth and growing power of corporate America, and therefore did not develop the kinds of protections against sort of, how shall I say, excessive corporate power. Please describe how you view the structure as it exists to protect people against corporate power.
Well, I mean, I think there are all kinds of entities in society that wield quote unquote power. And, it's a straw man on the left to beat up on corporations. But there are other, like I said, elements of society which wield a lot of power. The unions, for example, particularly public sector unions, wield a lot of power in terms of their ability to use their union dues, for example, to make sure that they then elect people to the government who are now beholden to the public sector unions in terms of the negotiations for their reimbursement packages. I mean, that's an element of corruption in which a government official who's supposed to be representing the population now actually ends up representing the unions who they negotiate for.
But well, isn't it a fairly standard thing to support elected officials who represent your values? And why would that be? Why is it characterized as corruption?
Well, that's what the corporations do. I'm just saying that from the left, they beat up on the corporations. But there are other elements in society, like I said, who wield power. I'm using the public sector unions. We can also use the media. The media wields an enormous amount of power in terms of not only financial contributions, but also with reference to shaping the thought processes and opinions of the population when it comes to elections.
Sure.
So, there are lots of things in society which you can say wields undue power, and just picking on the corporations, I think, is convenient. It's a convenient way to create an enemy when you're running for office. That kind of a straw man fight. When there are other things that we looked at. So does the Constitution protect against corporations, the media, unions? And I'm sure if I sat down and thought about it for a couple minutes, I could pick out all kinds of other parts of society which wield a lot of power. And how do you restrain that power? I mean, clearly the government wields the greatest amount of power.
Do you view corporations and unions as having comparable sort of motivations and end goals and therefore tactics?
Do I? Yeah, I do, actually. I think any organization, as I mentioned, that wields influence has self-interest fundamentally at the core of what they're doing. Unions, in the best, have the interest of the workers. At their worst, have the interest of the people who run the unions. Corporations at their best are actually sort of democratic constructions. They have shareholders who then vote for board members, who then make decisions with reference to how the corporation runs. That's in the best. In the worst, you have individuals who are out there making a lot of money and putting it in their pockets at the expense of shareholders in the corporation. I mean, and media at their best give a balanced view of what's going on in society and politics. At their worst, have their axes to grind and are trying to choose, for example, which one of the presidential candidates is going to get elected.
Paul, can you talk a little bit about some of what Dr. Fleitman said about unions?
Well, I think a major difference between a union and a corporation can be found right in the basic organization of the entity. A corporate entity is a legal fiction created by a state that basically has unlimited lifetime. It cannot die, and it exists. The way a corporation can be sued, if you want to sue a corporation, you have to sue it in one of two places, either where its headquarters operates or where it's incorporated. In most corporations in our nation incorporate in Delaware because of their unrestrictive corporate laws. A union, on complete contrast, a union can be sued in every state where any one of its members lives. So in my old local, IBW 2324 out in western Massachusetts, it could be sued in Vermont, it could be sued in New York, it could be sued in Connecticut, and it could be sued in Massachusetts because it's a different kind of entity. It does not exist separately from the members. The union only exists as an organization of these members. The individual members come together and form this group. It isn't its own separate entity. Whereas a corporation can then be sold off, it can change ownership, and it can live forever. If there are no more union members, the union local disappears. It doesn't continue on in perpetuity. However, Coca-Cola Corporation can continue going as long as there is at least one stockholder forever.
How does that affect each relative entity's interactions with the government and with the people?
We talked, Dr. Fleitman specifically mentioned public employees, and obviously there's a vast difference between a public employee union and a private sector employee union, which I was a member of. Private sector employee union is merely using the power of economics to their own advantage. That is capitalism. I say that's one of the most basic aspects of capitalism, is to use your economic power to gain advantage over the person or the entity you're attempting to gain power over. A public employee union operates from a very different perspective because the person they're at odds with is the sovereignty of our state, which is the people themselves, obviously are the sovereigns of our state, and that power is invested in our legislature. So when a public employee union is negotiating, it is negotiating against itself because every member of the public employee union is also a taxpayer, a citizen of the state. So it's an interesting conundrum. And I can see where people have maybe a different view of a public employee union versus a private sector union, but in the end, why should democracy end for you because you're at work? Why do you give up your right to have a say in your life because you're in the workplace? And especially just because you happen to be a teacher. So because you're a teacher, you should have absolutely no voice in what you're paid, in the hours and conditions of your labor, or anything like that.
Now, Dr. Fleitman, to that point, obviously I'm sure you have followed the events in Wisconsin. and in Ohio around essentially rescinding collective bargaining rights from public sector union employees. Now, what is your view on that and the dynamic that Paul discussed?
Well, I think the difference that I would take with him is that when unions, for example, or corporations, you have to step outside of their legal structure, because it's really how they exercise power outside of their internal structure which is an issue. I know, for example, private unions contributing to campaigns, or whether it's monetarily or in terms of forcing their manpower to go out and campaign for a particular candidate. That really sort of becomes the issue. So, for example, if you take a look at the automobile bailouts, let's take a look at Chrysler, for example, General Motors, either one of them. You now have a president clearly in whom the unions were really in his favor, supported his election, and so now when you're having General Motors or Chrysler go through a bankruptcy, because they had to go through a bankruptcy, they could have either gone through a standard legal bankruptcy or a bankruptcy that was directed by a president who benefited from their actions outside of their negotiations with the corporation. In other words, the support for his election. So what does he do? Rather than going through legal bankruptcy, he turns over large parts of the corporation to the unions who supported his campaign.
Now, couldn't the exact, if I may, couldn't the exact same argument have been made if John McCain had been elected and had gone through with the same thing, that the reason he did it was because the corporate donors to him?
Oh, I'm not arguing that.
Okay.
I'm not arguing it. The
Yep.
point that I'm making is that you can't just pick on corporations, because that was the premise of this whole discussion, is how do we protect the individual citizens against corporations. I'm saying it's not just corporations. It's the effects of all these other entities as well. I mean, if you're going to pick on them, let's talk about all of them. Let's talk about the effects that unions have, for example, on elections. And I'm not saying that an individual in a union can't support a candidate, though I would think if you actually went in there and looked at any given union member, there probably are a lot of union members who don't support the candidate that the union leadership does, but yet they're obliged to pay dues into that union, which then supports a candidate, and then the membership is forced to go into support of that candidate. Now, I don't mean to just pick on unions, because that's the problem here, is that the left picks on corporations and the right picks on unions. We can also then start picking on the media.
Right.
And the right picks on the media, more than the left does, because there's more of the media that's in concert with the left than perhaps Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, which is in concert with the right. So we're just talking about the fundamental premise that it's just the corporations in the United States.
And I'm going to agree with what you said in the fact that, say, overturning Citizens United, that should be directed at both corporations,
Yes.
Anybody that is spending large amounts of money. But here's the difference. When a corporation spends a large amount of money on a candidate, the people that work at Target don't have any say in how that money is being spent and where it's being distributed. Whereas in the union, now I'm a former chairman of the union political committee. Money that came to me was in the form of a PAC. You had to voluntarily sign up, and not every member of our union signed up. It was maybe 20% of the members voluntarily would give $1 a week out of their check, and that would come to me. And then every month we would have a meeting in the union hall, and anyone that gave money, and even anyone that didn't give money specifically to this PAC, was welcome to come, and we would take a vote. Are we going to give are we going to send an endorsement to Dr. Fleitman, or are we going to send an endorsement to Richie Neal? It was still democracy. So that is one of the major differences that I see in those models, even though I do agree on the basic premise that money is money, regardless of where it's coming from.
Now, corporations actually, particularly if they're
Are
shareholders,
democracies.
are democracies. It isn't the worker that's a part of that democracy, but it's a shareholder that's a part of democracy, because after all, that is what capitalism is about.
As a shareholder of Verizon, because I worked there for 10 years, I went to an annual meeting. It takes about 2 hours, and there's millions of us. We don't talk. We don't get to speak. And there's only been one successful shareholder initiative to pass over the objection of management in, I think, all of corporate history. And it was from Verizon workers in the last 5 years. Whereas, again, I'm in a union local of 1,000 people, and maybe 200 give money, and they can come and personally call me. I can't call Lee Iacocca or Bill Gates, but you can call down to the union hall and say, I want to talk to Paul Mark, and I want to ask why he's endorsing someone I don't like. That's
Well, I
where
mean, you
I see
actually-
it.
And I would say this. It seems to me that corporations and unions have fundamentally different imperatives, okay? Corporations arguably have different set of parameters and a different set of goals. If you look at business. The goal of a business is to make money.
That's correct.
And to eliminate obstacles to getting to that goal, a la regulation, a la other limitations on that possibility. You take, for example, environmental regulation. Now, and I understand that from your perspective, regulation is bad. You would characterize it as excessive regulation.
Well, I mean, it depends on the regulation.
Okay, so is it acceptable for a corporation to, and I mean morally acceptable, for a corporation to contribute large amounts of money to a politician to eviscerate environmental regulation because somehow it impedes their making a profit, even if it damages people's health?
Is it more? You know, again, we're picking the corporation as a straw man. You know, corporations.
I wouldn't say a straw man. I think it's a reasonable question.
Corporations do things which, if you want to say, are immoral. Yes, they do. Unions do things which are immoral. Media does things which are immoral. And so, you know, just picking on, like I said, one particular element of American society and setting that up as the bad guy, you know, because a lot of corporations do some very good things. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, yes, corporations are out there to make money, and they're out there to compete. And they're not only competing with each other in the United States, but we have corporations which are competing with entities in Europe, and now entities in China and Asia. And the truth of the matter is, if they win, then the jobs and the wealth go to Europe and China. If our guys win, then the wealth and the jobs come to the United States. And so these guys, you know, and without the creation of wealth by business and corporation, then the government has nothing to tax. And so businesses are a major part of the important structure of American society, because if you do not have wealth, you do not have anything to tax, you don't have a government, and you don't have government programs. So
let me ask you a question, okay? And we have limited time here, but by your overarching description, what I have read that you have said that essentially the most important role of government is national defense.
yes.
Now, beyond that, what is acceptable for a government to do?
What's acceptable for a government to do? Well, government is also, at least our government, is also directed at, I think, protecting the individual freedoms and liberties of the American citizens, and should always have that at the top of our agenda. That was
Okay, but how does one define individual liberties and freedoms? I mean, for example, as per my earlier question, I would hold that I have the sort of matter of course right to breathe clean air. Okay, that seems very fundamental.
right.
Some would argue that corporations have the freedom and the right to pollute the air. So where is the balance here?
See, I would say the problem is it's not that a corporation as an entity therefore has different rights, et cetera. It's a matter of there are some corporations that are maybe too powerful, that are maybe too big, or that are just not in compliance with laws that they should be following. And as Dr. Fleitman was saying, it's 90%, 95% of all corporations are doing the right thing. A lot of them are small businesses, family-owned, just as 90% of all unions, 95% of all unions are doing the right thing. Every union worker, when I was a union worker, I was out there fixing telephone lines and going to school at night. I wasn't some guy standing around a shovel on the side of the road doing nothing all day, which is the stereotype. So it's not fair to say because a corporation is a straw man that they're out flaunting the regulations. But it is fair to say that specific corporations that do invest a lot of money in certain political campaigns are doing that. That there are bad corporations that are out there more concerned with profit than with doing the right thing for the community. I'll use General Electric because I'm from Pittsfield area. And Jack Welch got his start in Pittsfield. And what did he do? He took General Electric and he decided, you know what? We don't care about Pittsfield. What we care about is making money. So we're going to abandon 10,000 workers, and we're going to leave our rivers and our land polluted, and we're going to move to Indonesia. And you know what? We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it cheaper because now we can get around the basic American principles of fair play.
Right. Now, I want to get into a different issue that is relevant specifically to Western Massachusetts and some of the issues we've discussed, which is broadband infrastructure. Now,
Which is what?
broadband infrastructure. You're aware of the issue, I assume?
Not really.
Okay. Well, you live in
Doesn't
Northampton,
happen.
which
Yeah.
well, I mean, essentially the issue is as follows, and for those of our viewers who are not aware of it, many Western Massachusetts towns are either unserved or underserved by high-speed internet, okay? That means now in 2012, a lot of people still have dial-up internet, okay? I live in a small town. A lot of people, I happen to have a satellite. A lot of people have dial-up. This is an issue of economic development. It's an issue of public safety. It's an issue of educational opportunity. It's an issue of basic fairness. A few years ago in 2008, the governor passed a $40 million broadband bill now, the reason for this gap is it has never been in the interest of large corporations to spend the money to wire these small towns in the same way as it was not in the interest of business to wire rural areas for electricity in the 1920s and 30s. Government intervened in that case to make sure that rural people had an equal opportunity and equal access to this resource. And in 2008, the governor, unlike his 16 years of Republican predecessors, recognized the government's role in intervening in this market failure. Now, in the current Senate race, for example, okay, Scott Brown voted for the governor's $40 million broadband bill. Then he went to the U.S. Senate and he voted to rescind $80 billion in stimulus money, saying that the stimulus had not created any jobs. He then sent a letter to the Department of Commerce 3 weeks later asking for that stimulus money, saying how many jobs it would create and how beneficial it would be. I'd like your views on whether or not that was an appropriate use of government resources to address a failure of the market. Now, I understand you're not aware fully of the issue, but as a general matter, does the government have a role to play in addressing these kinds of gaps?
Yeah, I mean, you had asked me the question, what were the major roles of a government? And so I was talking about, again, first off, defense of the nation and defense of the citizens, and then second, ensuring individual freedom and liberties. And, the Constitution does have a role for the government in terms of the federal government, in terms of managing, for example, interstate commerce. So there is provision in the Constitution relative to the government having some play in terms of some elements of the economy. And of course, where you draw the line is an issue. Now, the government very often has given, for example, tax incentives to favor some elements of the market, and in terms of expanding broadband internet access, I'm not sure how the state government has done it, but a very common way to create certain economic benefits is by tax incentives. And we see that all the time. I mean, for example, if a particular locality wants to bring business into the locality, whether it's Northampton in their industrial park or Amherst, what do? They give tax breaks to bring a company into town. You have less property tax or whatever, and that brings a company in. I mean, governments do that all the time. Municipalities and states, for example, will give huge tax breaks to movie makers to bring their companies and their filmmaking into town. I mean, that's a way you're able to favor a market. So yeah, I'm not saying there isn't a role of government, and how much of a role of government and how that government exerts its power to whose benefit sort of becomes the issue.
Paul, what are you? And we have to close shortly. But what are your thoughts on that as a former Verizon employee?
As a former Verizon employee, I know that a company like Verizon does not see a town like Peru as profitable, as worth their investment. We have a town probably 40 square miles with 850 people. It does not, in terms of profit, it does not make sense for Verizon to wire our town. There's 124 communities in Western Massachusetts that, at my house, I don't have cable TV, I don't have high-speed internet, I don't have cell phone coverage that works. There's 124 communities in Western Massachusetts that are like that, and we're part of only 5% of the entire nation that has basically internet and communication services that are worse than many third world countries. So I think it is completely appropriate that the federal government and the state government, working together in tandem, using the Interstate Commerce Clause powers of the federal government, and obviously the Congress's power to tax and spend, and the state powers, it is appropriate that they are investing in the middle mile infrastructure. But it is also appropriate that an individual, a group of private citizens in our towns is forming Wired West, what is known as Wired West, which is a cooperative of municipal light plants throughout Western Massachusetts, and we're going to take it upon ourselves to find private funding to facilitate the last mile. How the high-speed internet will get from, say, a town hall to my individual house.
Now, I wanted to wind things up, but I do want to say one final thing. Doctor, I read an article that you wrote an open letter to Senator Rosenberg about redistricting. And I do want to quote for the audience from that. It says, and this is, as the viewers may know, redistricting occurred in 2010, and you contend that the redistricting was undertaken to be most advantageous to the incumbent office holders. And you say that Amherst and Northampton, your hometowns, were attached to Worcester County to bolster McGovern's hold on this new district. Certainly I expect you to argue that we need to give McGovern a chance to show that he cares for our towns. Don't expect much. Distance counts, and Worcester has the votes. We will only have occasional McGovern sightings. Now, that reflects a certain cynicism, and I would point out that even now, before he's taken office, Jim McGovern has visited every single new town in the district, and I expect that he will continue to pay attention to this part of the district. You may view that as simply self-serving, but I would view it as being a reflection of his desire to represent his new district.
I don't think it was cynicism. First off, in terms of the redistricting, that's the way the game is played. In every state, when redistricting occurs, the party that is in power redistricts to maximize the probability that its candidates are going to win those congressional seats.
Sure.
And these folks did it, and I wasn't complaining about it because that's the way the game is played. And honestly, they did a very good job at it because virtually every candidate, Republican candidate that ran in 2010, was redistricted out of their previous districts. And what that does, having run a congressional campaign, what that does is that your entire structure, your entire set of contacts, people you knew, people who would work for you, are gone when you're redistricted out of your districts. And I can tell you, because I knew all the candidates that ran in 2010, that I think only 2 of them were still in the same district or in the same territory that they were before. And that was not done by accident. But that's the name of the game. That's what you do, and they were very, very good at it. I wasn't giving credit for it. In terms of McGovern and the 2nd Congressional District, Northampton and Amherst are outposts. And we were talking about this earlier. The reason I decided not to run again in 2012 was because the distances to do this campaign were so far, with me being all the way out in Northampton. The entire race would have been around Worcester and the Worcester suburbs. There was no campaigning out here because Northampton and Amherst, are very Democratic towns. There would be no point in Republican campaigning here. And McGovern wouldn't have to campaign here because he can count on the votes for these towns, so the entire race would be around Worcester. This district is Worcester-centric. That's where he's going to be spending most of his time. And in looking at the previous 2nd Congressional District, when I campaigned there, in the eastern part of the district, out by Bellingham and Milford and all those areas, what I heard all the time, because the central part of that district was Springfield, was that they never saw Richard Neal.
Sure, understood.
McGovern may show up from time to time, but you can bet your dollar he's going to be spending most of his time in and out, in and around Worcester and the suburbs of Worcester, because if he does have competition next time, if you can't win that area, you're going to lose this election. The curious part of this new 2nd Congressional District, I spent a lot of time trying to decide if I was going to run or not, is that when Scott Brown ran in 2010, whereas he won 52% of the entire state to 48 for Coakley, in the towns of this new 2nd Congressional District, he won 58 to 42. And so all the population of suburbs around Worcester in the 2nd Congressional District makes this a Republican district. So if he had had a credible candidate running against him, McGovern, he could very well have lost this district. As it ends up, nobody ran against him.
But I think the opposite of what you're saying is also just as true. I don't think redistricting, when that process was going on, when we were having committee hearings, when we were taking testimony from people throughout the state, I don't think the committee was looking at, oh, but where does such and such live that ran last time? Because it is not always. There are different circumstances, but it is just as easy to run from a new district. And so when I said, I think the opposite of what you said is also true, redistricting also draws out new opponents against incumbents. Richie Neal faced 2 serious primary challengers out of Berkshire County because Berkshire County was now part of his district. Jim McGovern had a primary challenge. A gentleman, I don't know where
Mr. Fiegba.
Yeah, I don't know where he lived. Congressman Keating drew a primary challenge. Richard Tissay is probably going to beat Congressman Tierney because of redistricting. So I think while it may sound convenient, you could never possibly redistrict to keep every potential challenger out of your district, unless you made it a district of 1. It's just impossible. No matter what changes you make, there are going to be new challengers, and there are going to be former challengers that are gone. Of 6 people ran in my election, I think 3 of them were in another district, and 2 of them were still in the district with me. So it's interesting.
Well, Richard Neal's competition in the Democratic primary, I mean, granted, Nucifaro was a reasonable opponent. The other fellow wasn't a real serious competitor for Richard Neal. And Nucifaro really didn't have a lot of chance of beating Richard Neal because, you know, his hold on Springfield and the suburbs of Springfield are so strong, and that's where all the population is in the new 1st Congressional District. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, when you're running in a district and you've ran the previous time and you run again, right, you're 1 leg up because you don't have to build an entire structure to run in that race. And you may have new people show up in your district, but in terms of somebody who had built a structure and that structure is gone because it's stripped out, it's not the same thing at all.
But no matter what congressional district Springfield is in, it is still going to be 1/7 of the population. The same goes true for Worcester. No matter which congressional district Worcester is a part of, it is going to be the dominant city.
Yeah, but I would tell you, for example, if it had been redistricted in the way that Northampton was now in with Springfield and Agawam and all those towns in whatever the new 1st Congressional District in, now I'm not saying that I would have beaten Richard Neal, but if I had gone back in that district with all the people that had worked with me in my campaign, and the structure and the contacts and donors who had contributed to the previous campaign, I would have been a leg up in terms of constructing a new race. On the other hand, if now the only towns that were in my previous race were Northampton and 1 or 2 others in southern Worcester County, rebuilding and recontacting all the folks in all these new towns is a much harder process. And it wasn't just me. I mean, it was the vast majority of Republican candidates who ran in 2010 were out of their previous districts. And again, that's what redistricting is. The folks who did it, Stan Rosenberg and his group, honestly, from their perspective, they did a great job at it, really. I mean, I'm not complaining about it, I'm not whining about it. They did a great job. This is what people do. That's not cynicism, that's the way the game is played.
Of 217 districts that changed, I would bet only maybe 6 of them were happy, and it was Holyoke, Westfield, Beverly, and Salem, because there are exactly enough people to be a single representative district, and they didn't change. Everyone else.
Are you talking about the state districts?
Reps, yeah. And for Congress, I mean, with reapportionment, we lost a congressman, so something drastic had to change.
I'm not saying redistricting didn't have to happen, and right. I'm not saying.
No, I'm saying so no matter what, there are going to be winners and losers. But you could make the same argument that Congressman Neal picked up 40% new turf, and he had the same exact obstacle that you would have. The difference being, of course, he has obviously been an incumbent for a long time and has considerably more resources at his disposal.
Well, the other benefit, too, is that the new 1st Congressional District is far more Democratic than Richard Neal's previous 2nd Congressional District. Right. Because, obviously I ran in it, so I know that district very well. Outside right. of Springfield and some of the suburbs in Springfield, the whole length of southern Massachusetts, and it's actually kind of a surprise if you look at these maps, the whole length of southern Massachusetts are actually all Republican towns, with the exception perhaps of Milford and Southbridge. They're all Republican towns. And so, Richard Neal, in his previous incarnation, had a fairly Republican district in his hands. The new 1st Congressional District, I mean, if you look at it all, there were a couple of Republican towns like Southwick and maybe Westfield, but all the towns of Berkshire County and Franklin County and, of course, Springfield, these are all Democratic towns. And I think Mother Teresa, if she was running as a Republican, couldn't beat Richard Neal in the new 1st Congressional District. So, you know, whoever won that primary, of course, is going to win that congressional
Thank you, Doctor,
seat.
for your perspective.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And Paul Mark, thank you for coming in and talking over your new role as a state rep.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of Politics 2012. And please remember to go out and vote on November 6th. Thank you.